Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, here we go. Look at that. It's the middle of the month in March. Where did that go? It's On the Ledge. It's the Ontario Politics Podcast. This weekend on the Friday, it's the Power Trio. John Wright not able to join us. He's off doing Maru public opinion work right now. So joined this morning, per usual, Keith Leslie is here and Sabrina Nanji from the Queen's Park Observer. And, you know, one of the things just popped into my inbox, Sabrina, just before we came on, was the latest from Angus Reid showing approval ratings. And if they're paying attention, and I expect they are, in Premier Ford's office, they're going to like that number. It shows him up 13 points since the last time the Angus Reid crew took a pulse on the Premier's approval rating.
Yeah, happy Friday to Premier Doug Ford. I'm sure he's toasting that right now. It's good timing because the election is just around the corner on June 2nd, and these are pretty healthy numbers for the Ford government. It's kind of been the polling trend that we've seen in a recent string of surveys, but like politicians like to say, the only poll that really matters is the one on election day. But if you're comparing to 2018, you know, Doug Ford swept a majority at Queen's Park with about 41% of the vote. So 43% from Angus Reid is pretty good. John Wright had a poll earlier this week too that I'm sure he would be talking about right now, showing Ford's approval at 37%. It was down slightly, but that's still a pretty healthy number for the premier, you know, heading into an election. So I think right now there's a lot of buzz that the Ford government is on track to, you know, win a second mandate from Ontario. I think there's a lot more speculation about whether that'll be majority or minority. And I'm always interested in the race for runner-up because the NDP and the Liberals have been neck and neck in a lot of them. But all in all, you know, a good start to the weekend for the Premier. I think we've kind of seen, especially internal polling from the government, suggest that when the COVID situation is bad, you know, things are locked down. There's a lot of restrictions and rules in place that the public isn't very happy with the Premier. And so we're kind of seeing restrictions lift. Masks are coming off on Monday in schools. There's been a lot of concern about that. But we had modeling from the science table this week that suggests that even though we might see an uptick in hospitalizations and ICU admissions, you know, the big marker that the government's making a lot of their decisions on right now, that it won't be as bad as it was during like the peak of Omicron earlier this year. So I think there's a lot to be positive about, but it still feels like a bit touch and go.
Well, Keith, the other thing that John will always tell us is if the leader is outpacing the party's approval ratings, that is a combination that they're really going to be happy with. And in this case, particularly with the Angus Reid numbers this morning, that would indicate that the Premier is outpacing the popularity of the party. And right now, as Sabrina points out, the popularity numbers put them in a place where, you know, if all things stay equal, and we can't really say that given what we've seen in the last couple of years, it's going to be a hard thing to knock off the rails.
Absolutely. I mean, at this point, Sabrina pointed out the numbers, you know, the government itself is polling at about 38%, which is close enough to getting a majority again, certainly to be reelected at a minority level. And the NDP and Liberals are virtually tied at about 27%. So that's 54% of voters that are looking somewhere else other than the Ford government at this point. But when it's such an even split like that, that is just perfect for the Conservatives. I mean, that helps you win a whole lot more ridings, which is why they got such a large majority last time with, you know, just about under 40% of the popular vote. The one thing he's not getting high marks for still is when they poll on how each premier has rated on their reaction to the pandemic. And he has not done particularly well in that. And it'll be, you know, remain to be seen how top of mind that's going to be on June the 2nd. It's certainly going to be brought up by the opposition parties during the campaign, which, by the way, begins in just, 6, 7, 8 weeks. It's a very short time frame till they're actually out on the campaign trail with their new budget in arms to tell us what it's going to be. Right now, the Liberals and NDP have to figure out which one of them, as Sabrina says, is going to be the front runner, which one of them can pull ahead of the other. Because if they stay even like that, that just is going to allow Ford to just walk right back in with the majority government, despite any hits from the pandemic handling. And even if it'll be interesting to see. I think there's still a lot of concern about the mask mandate being lifted on Monday. When the kids come back from schools. It seems that the doctors, kids, hospitals, anyone in the healthcare sector is basically saying, let's wait 2 weeks after spring break ends, because there's going to be a whole lot of socializing has gone on in this past week, things that weren't normally being done during the pandemic. Let's, to be safe. And of course, we see the government in the chief medical officer of health turning down requests from school boards to extend that mask mandate. No, they're coming off on Monday. That seems a bit rushed, and again, it could come back to bite them if what we're seeing going on, China and Hong Kong and Singapore completely locked down because of this next wave of Omicron. Are we thinking that won't come here, especially after the spring break in schools? It seems rushed. It seems purely political to be lifting the mask on Monday instead of waiting 2 weeks, especially when we're seeing this from all of the healthcare providers and the family doctors. So if this works out well for the Ford government and this next wave doesn't, it becomes a wavelet, as they say, and it doesn't really matter and it doesn't hit schools that much, that'll be good for the government. But if it does come back and they have to reimpose some sort of restrictions or even lockdowns before the May election campaign begins, that'll be disastrous for them.
I talked to an administrator at a private school in Toronto last week, and indicated that before their March break, 30 of their kids tested positive. I said, well, how severe was it? He said, yeah, it was teenagers having a few sniffles, but they tested positive. I said, so what's the plan? We're going to keep the masks on for 2 weeks. And so there's the private schools being able just to kind of do what they want. They don't have to go cap in hand to the school board, who has to, in turn, go cap in hand to Queen's Park for permission. But on that number, though, and I would be curious to get both of your take on that, as far as the handling of the pandemic, Sabrina, are we making too much of this? Because if these approval ratings are 43% from Angus Reid's people, and he's slipping or taking a beating on the Omicron and COVID handling, does it matter?
Look, I think that the big ballot question isn't going to be so much, how did the Ford government handle the pandemic? It's going to be more about how are we coming out of it? Because, we've passed the 2-year mark now. And of course, if it was up to the opposition, it would be, the question of how did Doug Ford handle this virus? And opposition parties always have a hard time getting their message out. They've had a hard time, reminding people of some of the gaffes that have happened over the last 2 years and some of the problems with the decision making around that. So, I think everyone wants to hear from the government in times of pandemic. Like you mainly just want to hear from the powers that be. But from what I'm seeing in the polls, it's kind of reflective of what I've been hearing from voters like on the ground. Even people who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves conservatives or even folks that like Doug Ford as a politician, they seem to be pretty okay with how things are. They say, well, he's done his best. They've been pretty forgiving. So I think, I don't know if that's a high or low bar for our electorate, but I think that, it seems likely that, the Ford government could get a second chance. I think it's going to come down to like regional races too, because obviously we don't, just elect a premier directly. There's a lot of incumbents that the Ford government is losing, some high profile contenders like Christine Elliott and Rod Phillips. And, that's going to leave a huge hole for the PCs. So I think that, you're going to hear a lot of messaging about how Ontario is coming back stronger than ever. They've already been running those ads right now. That's the message they're going to be pushing. And honestly, it does sound good to voters. I think that the state of the COVID situation, when voters go to the polls actually closer to June, that, that will have a big impact on how they cast their ballot. So, as Keith said, like with all this anxiety about restrictions lifting, especially masks in schools, if there is an uptick and we have to shut back down again, I can't imagine that voters are going to be very happy with the Conservative government.
Well, I should just tell you that I'm podcasting from the world headquarters of the Story Studio Network here we're in Eastern Passage, Nova Scotia, and just I'm spending some time visiting with Aaron and Dan and the girls. But I note, Keith, that Premier Houston in these parts, 73% approval rating. I mean, this guy could walk on water.
Oh, absolutely. As a progressive conservative, and I emphasize the progressive here, not just the conservative, but he's certainly a really popular premier. He got, his predecessor, the Liberal Premier Rankin, was one of the very few, I think the only one perhaps, to get defeated in an election during the pandemic. And this conservative premier here got elected by saying, you know what, I'm going to run a deficit, and I'm going to put basically all that $500 million deficit into healthcare, into getting doctors and ambulances and all that stuff that sorely needs addressing in Nova Scotia. And boy, did that message resonate. And it didn't hurt his campaign at all in the middle of that there was a fellow laid in his driveway for 2 hours in Dartmouth, not exactly a rural area of Nova Scotia, waiting for an ambulance. It really helped drive that message home. But since then, again, being very pragmatic, dealing with things very open, and the progressive conservatives are a breath of fresh air in this province. That's a unique thing to say, I think, in most provinces right now. The conservatives are seen, as right-wing, ideological. He is not that way at all. I mean, he might be right-wing in his views, but he is not ideological bent. If it's a smart thing to do, he's doing it, and he's really getting out there with his health minister and making the announcements, trying to get this thing started on the healthcare front where he promised to put all his emphasis. It's unique to see. He as taking over in the middle of a pandemic, it's quite restrictive what he can do. A lot of money's been committed and spent, and yet he's gone out, and done exactly what needs to be done. Certainly, he's very popular with people right now. As you note, 73%. That's a high rating, and certainly for a conservative premier in this country during the pandemic, I think it's a record.
So let me ask you this. Be the strategist for us then, Sabrina, because if you look at what Premier Houston's doing here in Nova Scotia, and we already hearing Doug Ford saying, it's not about political stripe, it's just about doing the right thing. I wonder if he's able then to say, this is a conservative government in Nova Scotia that's doing the right thing. I'm able to cut some of that grass as well and sort of take some of that out. I got to think that that conversation is going on in that conservative war room in Ontario.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that, the Premier's office, his camp right now is really galvanized seeing those numbers too. And, to Keith's point about ideology, I mean, we've kind of seen the Ford Conservatives do a bit of a 180 on a lot of their policies. Since 2018, we've kind of seen a lot of worker-friendly legislation coming out. The Premier has been making announcements alongside union leaders. That's not something we would typically expect from a conservative government. And so I think obviously, there are some lessons for the Conservatives in Ontario here too. They're now pumping themselves up as the party of yes, the party that builds, they've got record spending. Whereas in 2018, they kind of came to power promising to cut the gravy train, austerity, getting rid of the $6 million man at Hydro One, that type of stuff. And so he's singing a completely different tune right now. I think that how we were talking about how the NDP and the Liberals, there's a real tight battle there. A lot of Ontarians might consider themselves liberal or a small L liberal. At least the Liberal brand is still very strong in Ontario. And even though in 2018 they were decimated, that was kind of a change election. Whereas now we can kind of see maybe the PCs moving towards the so-called center of the political spectrum and basically gunning for Stephen Del Duca, the Liberal leader, and his policies. Like, they're very quick to come out with attack lines whenever he's making an announcement. They like to bring up his political baggage, tie him to Kathleen Wynne. So I think that, it's definitely a different tone from the Ford government right now. And they are actually kind of in a position to run on a bit more of a moderate, if I can call it that, platform, because they've been in government, because they've been in power. And so, the Premier can present himself, in a very Premier-like, and obviously that helps when you're running for re-election. It's not really lost on me that his approval rating is going up, and we have been seeing more of him. He's been making these flashy campaign-style announcements all over the province, and that seems to be working in his favor. And of course, us journalists, we're good at giving the government, the people in charge, the most coverage right now. We're still in a pandemic. And So it's interesting to see all the branding, that we're getting during these government announcements. We could hear the premier, making all these funding announcements for hospitals and using campaign slogans saying, we're the party that says yes. So it's definitely, they're singing a different tune, and they obviously think that they're going to be able to, hang on to power with it.
It's interesting to me, Keith, that when we look at the bookends in terms of who are the most popular, it's British Columbia and Nova Scotia. And Premier Horgan in British Columbia has done exceptionally well through the pandemic. He actually called an election saying he needed the mandate, remember, to really manage this and deal with it. He's, up a point at 55%. But the only, again, back to Houston and Ford, Houston up 16 points, Ford up 13%. And as you point out, the baggage around COVID is still holding them back a little bit. I want to know, based on that kind of dynamic, and we've got, all of the spectrum covered, how will that inform the federal conservative leadership debate over the next 6 or 8 months? Because that's going to be critical in terms of watching how this is playing out in Nova Scotia, in Ontario, in Western Canada. I mean, Scott Moe, he's at 51%. So, there's a real interesting view here of what Canadians want. You got the NDP premier in the middle of all that.
Oh, absolutely. It's a fascinating dynamic right across the country for a Conservative Party that wants to appeal right across the country and its big tent ideas. And you've got, a socialist New Democratic government on one coast, a progressive Conservative government on the other, and as you say, everything else in between. How are they going to do this? Where are they going to go? I watched a webinar 2 days ago with Brian Mulroney. He did it for St. Francis Xavier University. And he commented quite a bit on the leadership race. And he said, Conservatives really have to ask themselves if they want a candidate that can win a convention or if they want a candidate that can win an election. And I think, that sums up what the battle of the Conservative Party is for right now. Are you fighting for the soul? Are you with Pierre Poilievre? And it's got to be a hard right conservative, always on the attack. Almost the politics of victimhood. We're being held back. Government is a negative force in our life. Or are you going to go on the more progressive views with Patrick Brown, who can sell a ton of memberships and perhaps win a convention? Can he win an election? Very interesting question. Will it be Jean Charest, the old warhorse coming up the middle? It's very interesting, and I think Charest of them all is the one that is able to see ways of bridging those huge differences across the country, merely from his tenure of doing it so long, and from the fact he was, a progressive conservative in Ottawa and a liberal in Quebec City. We know there's variances across the world how these definitions roll out, but those are the realities of it, and he can work with the other parties. He's proven he can work with the other parties. So is he yesterday's man? That's the question for the young Conservatives. Can he peel across the country, or as Mulroney says, can he win election? Mulroney also cautioned them against this politics of personal destruction, he called it. It said, you don't need to seek out to destroy your rivals. I thought there was some, pretty strong words of caution from Mr. Mulroney. But again, he was a progressive Conservative prime minister, and that party no longer exists.
Well, except, let's face it, when it's great, but in the rearview mirror, Brian Mulroney was eating their young at that stage of the parties.
As people
the whole
said, Joe Clark might had a few things to say about Mr. Mulroney's comments. Yes.
And then, we can go back to the Chrétien and Martin days and just to think of how well they got along. But at the same time, I think the message does resonate to some degree, Sabrina, in as much as I don't think people want to hear a whole lot of inside politics, down in the weeds, kind of literally eating their young. Seriously, let's get to the point now where we've seen in 2 years, we have shown flashes of leadership. We've shown flashes of vision and innovation. Let's take that and move that forward. I think there's an appetite for that.
Yeah, this is the third time in 7 years or less that the Conservatives are picking a new leader. I'm, as a political nerd, I would maybe suspect some listeners are here too. I'm ready to pass me the popcorn. I think this is going to be fun to watch, but I think that the timing is interesting because of the Ontario election and obviously, all the contenders so far, except for Jean Charest, they're from Ontario, and Ontario can make or break you federally. Of course, it's, such a vote-rich province, but I think voters don't always differentiate between the federal parties and the provincial parties. And so they might just be kind of completely tuned out, what with Ontario having another election, or having an election in June, and then, in September, the Conservatives picking their leader. I think that it's interesting to see the Ontario players that have already come out too. And, Doug Ford has kind of said that publicly he nor his MPPs will be endorsing anybody. I guess I'm hearing that could change, after June 2nd, on June 3rd, that they might be more free to publicly endorse. Yeah. I've heard that behind the scenes, everyone's already kind of picking their favorites, but, it's a smart move on the premier, because Ontario has a lot of volunteers, a lot of resources for the Conservatives. And of course, the Ford government wants those guys, that money, those resources focused on winning the PC's re-election provincially. Now, of course, they're obviously separate entities, but, some of the same volunteers, strategists, there's a lot of overlap there behind the scenes. Yeah. And it's just interesting timing, because the deadline for signing up members that can vote in the Conservative race is literally the day after the provincial election on June 2nd. So this is going to be a lot of inside baseball, but it's just going to be election overload, I think.
One thing I did want to, while we're talking about the federal scene, I did want to mention is something I thought was interesting this week. Court ordered Maxime Bernier to pay Warren Kinsella's court costs, $132,000 court costs for a libel case. That is significant. It was a slap lawsuit, essentially. The court saw it that way, but to order the payment of $132,000 in court costs for Kinsella, that's significant. I think that's going to open up a lot more comment the next federal election against Mr. Bernier and his People's Party. We'll see where it goes, but I think it was a really important and interesting court ruling this week.
Now, my read of that was Bernier personally. It's not the party, right?
True enough. It was Bernier personally, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So and that's significant, because in as much as he was claiming, the whole idea of being defamed and so on,
and hurt him and all that.
Yeah. Exactly. And I realize the defamation laws are different here than they are in the United States, but that kind of thing's going on right now with Sarah Palin in the New York Times, right? And the whole idea that if you are a public figure, you are more susceptible or open to, you must be ready to absorb more criticism, even as personal as it may be. So it's an interesting parallel in terms of the decision there, right?
Absolutely.
So before we go, I just want to I saw your newsletter post on what's going on with the NDP and Mr. Miller. What the hell is going on there, Sabrina? That seems out of the blue.
Yeah, that one's a big mystery. And so Paul Miller, veteran, longtime NDP MPP for Hamilton East Stony Creek, also, the sort of neighbor to NDP leader Andrea Horwath riding over in Steeltown. He got booted from the party. And that's, I think was a huge surprise to all of us. Paul Miller has had his fair share of controversy during his tenure. I think, there's always this buzz around Queen's Park that he doesn't quite get along with Andrea Horwath and her camp. I think, the biggest sign for me was that he doesn't really talk a lot during question period. But he's also had a lot of drama. There were some allegations against him from one of his staffers of, harassment and bullying. His wife is a local school trustee in Hamilton. And she's also been sanctioned by the board there, including once for letting Paul Miller, listen in on a phone call, a private phone call with trustees that he wasn't supposed to be there. So, he has been a thorn in the side to the NDP, but he's been allowed to be part of. He's sat in caucus and allowed to run for them since 2007. So it's this big mystery, and the party is not divulging the straw that broke the camel's back. They just say that it's nothing criminal as far as they know, but there's just some unacceptable information about him out there. And so Paul Miller is fighting back. He's not really saying much about it either. He has retained legal counsel, considering taking action against the party, and basically accused them of fabricating something that led to his ouster. So there's a lot of questions here. I don't know if it was the smartest move for the NDP not to give us, an actual reason for it. Not because they they have to. They are a political party. They're kind of a private entity in a sense. And so they can have whoever they want on their team. But no doubt the opposition parties are going to be jumping on this. I've been working my sources. I'm sure the opposition parties research teams are going to try and be digging into whatever this dirt is. But it's not a good look. There's a lot of speculation going around right now. And of course, not really addressing those questions. I think this is going to be something that gets a lot of oxygen, continues to make headlines. Andrea Horwath will have to face questions on it. And I think this could, be a lot of drama for her and could hurt her on the campaign trail.
Well, it's interesting, Keith, it comes a week after the Patrick Brown CTV case was agreed upon and settled. And again, we don't know that it has anything to do with it. We don't know if it's Me Too. But the problem is, as soon as you create that vacuum, we want to fill it, right?
Well,
that's a problem for everybody involved as far as the NDP is concerned.
Is it ever? As we used to say to younger journalists when I was helping them learn, how to write and stuff, is don't raise more questions than you answer. And that's exactly what they've done. Just weeks before the campaign is to actually begin, 15-year veteran member has been elected 4 times in Hamilton East Stony Creek. Loses it, gets kicked out of the caucus, can't run as a New Democrat. Okay, why? Why? Many times, as you said, is it a Me Too? We don't know. There's no suggestion of that whatsoever. We have no idea. We don't mean to suggest that as an option. We're just saying it's raising those kind of questions. Mr. Miller says that whatever they've come up with, I think he calls it ridiculous. But he also says that he's been pushing them for a year. Like, why haven't I had my nomination meeting? Is a sitting MPP that you usually run uncontested and you get that taken care of. It's just taking care of business earlier. He thought, and he says that he was convinced they were looking for younger and more ethnic candidates, that they wanted, basically he's an old white guy and they want him out. I think if that was the case, it would have been done months ago, not weeks ago.
Yeah, get the dirty laundry out of the way, get the fight out of the way. Yeah.
So what on earth has the leader, Andrea Horwath, learned in this recent vetting process, vetting of a 4-time reelected member? What have you learned that you didn't know before? Is it recent behavior? Is it something from the past? It's not criminal. Then what exactly is it? I'm sorry, you've raised more questions than you've answered. And as Sabrina said, and we're going to be asking them at any NDP appearances now by the leader, not to mention chasing down Mr. Miller and getting, and trying, his lawyers, I'm sure, will have something to say about this as well. Why would you do this to yourself? You're shooting yourself in the foot this far. It must be, as you say, so it's making us think it's pretty bad, but it's not criminal.
Yeah.
So where are you going? It's just you've raised more questions than you've answered. That's not what you ever want to do with a statement. You didn't put it to bed. That's for darn sure.
Well, it reminds me sort of the opposite of the musician who's been on the road for 15 years and becomes an overnight success.
Yes.
All right, that'll do it for us this week on The Ledge. It's the Ontario Politics Podcast. We produce it for Story Studio Network. You should drop by the website, by the way. Lots going on. We've got new shows in the works, and so lots to keep you busy. By the way, this will drop into the daily brief feed, and all week long, we've been featuring some of the shows that we produce at Story Studio Network. So just a good sampling of the cross-section and the fairly wide range of subject matter that we cover. So take a look, take a listen, and if you like it, subscribe and follow and share. That'll be great. All right, that'll do it for this week on The Ledge. I'm Dave Trafford. It's an Eye Contact production.